Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Pro AV Today. If you have ever watched this show, I talk incessantly about the renaissance and the resurgence of the end user and how the end user specifically is driving a lot of the innovation today in both AV and emerging markets. And when we talk about some of those emerging markets, specifically on the video collaboration side, things like hospitality, healthcare, and education, the demands from the end user look a lot different than they do on the AV side. And I brought on my next guest today is an expert in the field with 20 plus years of experience really in VCC and all the collaboration technologies across the board. Now with Logitech, I've got Scott Wharton, the VP and GM of video collaboration over, like I said, at Logitech. Scott, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here. You can see I've worked in this a long time. I can't get enough of it, obviously.
Well, that's an interesting starting off point. I mean, I think you have a lot more experience than most people in the UCC and the VCC space, and that actually is a really good thing. But, talk about that a little bit, right? We live in this post-pandemic world where UCC and collaboration tools kind of fit a certain mold, but even 2 to 3 years ago, it looked a lot different. Talk about some of those differences.
Well, I think in the video conferencing space that had been growing for a while, and we were growing steadily. But I think that what the pandemic did is really show people as much as a mind shift more than technology. Like, this stuff works, it's effective, and I no longer generally am having discussions with people about, oh, do I need video? Do I need to be seen? Like, I think people know that it generally works and is effective. So I think the discussion has shifted from should I be using it to how I should be using it. And then I think the pandemic and hybrid work, which I'm sure I'll talk about, has uncovered all these new scenarios and use cases where it's actually harder and things broke and we need to relook at things and do it differently.
Well, you talk about that mind shift being relatively new in a lot of cases, and many companies, even tech companies, weren't ready for that type of transition. So what you've seen is a lot of the decision makers and people that are really kind of filling the role of the IT integrator and installer for these companies are people who, for the first time, are having to do a lot of research on these products. How do you engage those people? How is that something that you bring to the table really for the first time in a lot of these cases for these people?
Well, one of the fun things about my job is that I get to talk to a lot of end users around the world, both enterprise, small business, channel people, and as well as end users. And I think it gives you a good sense of where people are struggling and what the needs are. And instead of doing only formal market research, which we do, I mean, a lot of it is just really getting down into understanding people's pain points. And sometimes it's at industry shows like an Infocom at ISE, like I just went to. Sometimes it's just like at the July 4th barbecues where I get to talk to people who are running businesses, and you hear a much different perspective where people are not as technically savvy and they're struggling a little bit. And that gives you also a little window and insight about what people want and where we as an industry have a lot more to go to fix some of these challenges.
Well, you talk about the end user. I just had Ken for Modus VR on my show. And we talked actually a lot about the kind of the crossover and the integration between, hardware manufacturers like Logitech and providers like Modus VR, where we've made it easier for the end user to actually visualize and see, because in a lot of cases, especially in some of these non-traditional markets, they're not quite as used to the normal AV channel, the distributor channel, as maybe a lot of the more traditional AV companies are. Talk about that end user perspective from, maybe some of these emerging markets like education and hospitality. What are some of the differences that you're seeing in those end user needs versus maybe traditional hardcore AV guys?
Well, I think traditionally a lot of the focus was more on, these very big rooms or boardrooms. So most companies would have video only for the executives. So you'd have the stereotypical, all right, boardroom, and 5% of the rooms would have video and everything else would have a screen or a speaker phone. And I think there's just a big shift where people realize now that video is something you need kind of everywhere. I think the other shift that most people didn't realize is, even into the pandemic, people said, well, I'll put video in some rooms and audio in others. And we go, why?
Why would you do that? Yeah.
You can get audio essentially for the same price as you do for a speakerphone. So I think that was a change. And then I think because of that, it changed the discussion from, bespoke quotes for a few rooms to how do I roll it out to everyone? And it changed the discussion from, customization and expense to scale. Like, how do I scale this up? How do I put it everywhere? And how do I make sure that you can roll out a space where an IT person is not hovering over, diving in to fix it? It needs to kind of be self-contained where an end user could walk in and it just works. So that I think for the industry was a big shift in mindset about how do you even set this stuff up.
Well, it's an interesting point you bring up too, because we talk a lot about the end user. Traditionally in the channel, the end user is in theory represented by the integrator, right? Where normally a lot of times they'll be the gatekeeper of information. They'll be the prescriptive and proactive person really acting on behalf of the end user. Have you seen that channel evolve at all in some of these new markets?
I have. I mean, in some ways, there was a conflict of interest in that some of the people in the channels, they like complexity because it's more money and it's fun, and there's also the comfort zone of really working in these big rooms. Whereas I think the end users really, I would say, pulled the industry and the channel more to, I want it simple, I want it ubiquitous. Not every room needs to be 50K, and if you go to some small rooms like a huddle rooms, like $2,000-$3,000 is fine. So I think those attributes were traditionally served by more of an IT channel. So I've seen the AV channel morph more to be IT-like, or if they haven't, they're going to lose business.
Right.
And then you see the IT, channels really morph more into like AV light, where they are going where the traditional AV channels were, and in some cases stealing share from them. So that's an interesting battle.
Well, you talk about some of those needs evolving too, and one of the things that's been really interesting in the last obviously couple years post pandemic is that the demand for the exact same piece of gear looks a little bit different, right? So users now expect a lot more flexibility and modularity than they probably would have had before. And what I mean by that is you talk about that 25 by 25 room, that executive wants a similar setup, if not the exact setup in his house or her house, but they don't have a room that's that big, but they want it to function the same. How do you take those two demands and kind of merge them together?
Yeah, I think that one's a funny one. I know there's a lot of idea or demand that you set up your home like your office. I actually think they're quite different for the reasons that if you're in an office, those rooms are really designed for 6, 8, 12, 20 people. So the demands from an AV IT perspective are very different in terms of space and the way you capture a room and audio. Whereas at home, I actually think those solutions are, even though they're more expensive, they're worse. Like actually, if you're an end user, much better to have a big screen in front of you with a high-end webcam and maybe like a dock or a speakerphone. I actually think the experience for both people is better. And sometimes I think people are, they're like, well, isn't the more expensive solution better? And I go, no, actually, the cheaper one is better.
Yeah, no, and look, that's something that not a lot of AV manufacturers are willing to say, but that's a great point. And I think a testament really to Logitech is that you guys scale so well, right? Everything from like small micro webcams all the way up to massive and larger video conferencing systems. How do you kind of manage really a portfolio like that, right? When the demand for these products is so high, but how do you act prescriptively and say, hey, you know what? It's cool that you want this, but maybe you really should get a smaller, setup.
Yeah, I would say it's before the pandemic, we tried to break the mold of a room as a room and say, all right, there are different kinds of rooms. So pre-pandemic, we had a very simple model. It's a t-shirt size, small, medium, large. And we would say, all right, for a small room, you need X for 4 to 6 people. Medium, you need more zooming and maybe an optical camera. And then large, you need a lot more distributed audio. I'd say now, post-pandemic, it's gotten a little more nuanced where there are a lot more phone booths, or I think like what people call focus rooms, where maybe it's just 2 to 3 people, or maybe 1. That might need a different solution. Where now there are these rec rooms or breakout rooms where you can't have it fixed and nailed down. So there's kind of an emphasis on modularity and putting stuff on wheels and moving things around. So I think and then at home or for the personal user, I would say there used to be a desk as a desk, and I think that's absolutely no longer true. Like your home office. For a lot of people, they may want to have a speakerphone because they're in an open space. Try to do that in an open space now where you're annoying the hell out of everyone with, on a speakerphone. Like you can't do it. So, and, I'd even argue in the office, you don't have most people are going to move to flex desks. So you need something that's more like hot desking, docks. So all these solutions that were monolithic are now breaking into smaller and, more different use cases. And then we'll talk about verticals in a minute, but I think it's another example of how if you follow the end users and their needs, you find that these things actually they're not the same, they're different. So I think what we've tried to do is just listen to our customers and find out where their needs are different. And then we've started to create solutions that are even more specific for, let's say, a telephone booth, which is different from a huddle room.
Right. Well, I mean, we'll dive into the verticals now, but you look at, something like education where a teacher may need to roll a display with a camera from classroom to classroom to classroom to outside to, anywhere else in the school. The challenge at that point becomes a lot of times that teacher shouldn't be responsible for the actual we'll call the AV integration or installation side, right? They expect to plug the thing in and make it work. And that's really one of the challenges in some of these new emerging markets is that there is a bit of a knowledge gap. But, as a hardware manufacturer, how do you design around that?
Well, I think you have to think about their capabilities differently. So I think a lot of us are used to talking to the enterprise IT managers, and they're really smart and they have a lot of capability and they've got money on an ongoing basis to maintain it. They can afford to pay for things where there's a total cost of ownership payback. You go into a school district, and a lot of times either they don't have money, so you have to kind of lower things down, but their needs aren't any different, right? The space is a space. And then the other thing is they don't have a big IT staff. A lot of them, so you have to design things that are way simpler. And then another scenario that's different is if you think about it, if you're in a regular conference room, you have a monitor and an AV thing up front, and everybody's looking forward. Classroom is flipped. Teachers over here, students are over here. So if you have the camera out, you can't see the teacher. If the camera pointing in, the audio is in the wrong direction. So, it kind of forces you to think about how do you redesign it for a classroom, which is very different than a traditional medium-sized conference room.
Well, one of the things too that is a massive challenge, I think, in some of these newer markets, and is that a lot of these newer markets, we'll say education, for example, is not quite as used to the shorter product life cycle, maybe that a lot of AV and maybe enterprise partners are. Case in point, they might buy a projector and not change it for 15 years, or buy a camera and not change it for 15 years. From a manufacturing perspective, I wouldn't say that's the best case scenario. So how do you as a manufacturer deal with some of those product life cycle challenges, right? Obviously you want them to buy new, better gear, but how does that impact you guys?
Well, I would say one of the ways that we're adapting to that is we're trying to adopt from a standalone hardware, and then it has a useful life, and then you throw it out, to more of like the Tesla model, where you have a base product, it has smart software, and you constantly update the software, where the product evolves over time and actually gets better over time, like a lot of our cars are doing now. I think the second thing is we're trying to move to more of a hybrid of equipment and services. So if people are keeping it more, then you could provide some value over services. Now, I think we're trying to move away from the extortion model where you pay 20% every year and you get nothing for it. So I think over time, what we'll see is, all right, people will pay some value for equipment and then some value over time for some services that go along with it. And those could be like advanced RMAs, better tech support, analytics, and so on. And actually, that's good for the world too, because you don't want, as a maker of goods, you don't want people throwing everything out. Like, it's not very sustainable. So, I mean, if people start moving more to that model where they're upgrading things via software and services, I think it's actually better for both sides. But obviously, you have to shift your business model a little bit toward that goal to make it work for everybody.
Well, that's a great point. And we are quickly approaching a ceiling of, I kind of call it the 4K ceiling. I will get a lot of crap for this, but they're at a certain point, the value and the productivity of a piece of gear hits a ceiling for the end user, right? You could go above 4K, but the user really isn't going to know the difference. You talk about HDR and things like that, and that's great. But to the end user, it's all kind of the same at a certain point. And when you start talking about some of those firmware and feature updates and really service and support, that seems like something really realistically that the end user would want.
I agree with you, and I think that what I tell my team is I want to avoid the GoPro problem. They very quickly
exactly.
4K. I saw today they're like on Hero 10, 8K. Honestly, who cares? Like, it was good enough at probably 1080p. And the good thing is there are so many problems to solve, whether they're cabling or touch management or smart layout of moving the cameras around. And I mean, there are just a million problems to solve. Almost none of them have to do with updating the fidelity of the video itself. So again, I think it goes back to just, if you listen to your customers, that none of them are really screaming at us saying, God, Scott, when are you going to have 8K? Like, I just have to have it. said no one, ever.
Yeah, I feel like you and I would get along very, very well in some of our extended conversations about the industry kind of moving to advances that people may not want. But I'll leave you with this, Scott. I'll give you the last word. What would you say excites you most for conferencing, collaboration, UCC, even in the next 5 years? What excites you most?
I was reading something the other day from Mark Andreessen, who is the founder of Netscape, the first browser, and billionaire at Andreessen Horowitz. And he was saying that he thought that the move to hybrid work could be a bigger move for civilization than the internet. That's a pretty bold statement. And part of what he meant by that, and he explained, is that for all of human history, we were organizing ourselves around being together in the same space. We had to be. Now we have the opportunity to organize ourselves by common interests and skills rather than geography. So if you think about what that means, there could be this complete unwinding and delinking of us working together based on where we are. That has so many consequences. And what I'm excited about it is that is the promise. But the reality is, I think most of us out there have been in some of these meetings where some people are in a location, some are remote. And if we're honest, they kind of suck. So I think there's so much opportunity to fix it. And I think we have a pretty good handle on, how do we do that? I would say our vision for that is more big sports and Hollywood than Silicon Valley. So what do I mean by that? If you're watching a sporting event, you don't have one camera following the action. You got dozens, maybe hundreds of cameras. You have a smart director moving everything around. They're choosing a shot for you. You're not sitting at home with a remote control or a joystick moving it around. You're watching the brilliance of this interaction. So if we can take that analogy and move it to people being remote and maybe have a better experience being remote than in a big room, I think that's super exciting. And I think we're well on our way to our journey of doing that. There's so much more to do, but I think we've already done a lot there with smart gallery, grid view technology, multiple cameras, but so much more to go to kind of solve that problem for letting people be wherever they want to be.
Well, the broadcaster in me just got really, really excited, and that's an unfair way to leave us hanging. But Scott, hey, I appreciate you coming on the show today. We got to have you back on soon because obviously this thing changes every few days. It seems like there's always something new. There's always some demand that we're trying to meet, and even a new market that we're jumping in. But ladies and gentlemen, Scott Wharton from Logitech. Scott, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, and I'd love to do it again. Let's do it.
And thank you guys so much for tuning in. Stay tuned for the next episode of Pro AV Today.